Now, it's not usual to come out with one of the main points you want to make right at the beginning of a talk, but just for a change, I thought I would. And it's this: doubt is not the opposite of faith, it is one element of faith. And this was said by someone much wiser than me, the theologian Paul Tillich. And I must say it was a quote I was very glad to have discovered, because you see, I've always been something of a doubter. And for many years I assumed I was something of a substandard Christian because of it. Paul Tillich allowed me to think that maybe I wasn't, maybe I was just a standard Christian after all. So I agree with Tillich, I wonder if you do. Discuss, as they say in the exam papers. But no, don't discuss now, though I do hope it will be something you discuss later, maybe over coffee or over lunch, or just think about on your own. Doubt is not the opposite of faith, but one element of it. Certainly, when it comes to the idea of resurrection, doubt seems to have been there right from the start, as both our readings proved. Only a day or so after Jesus rose from the dead, Thomas, despite being one of his innermost circle and having heard all his teachings, was completely disbelieving when others told him they'd seen the Lord. You can almost hear him, can't you? Yeah, right. You really think I'm going to believe that? I'm going to have to see it first. But then he did. It was a whole week later, mind you, and maybe it was a mark of the disciples' determination to stay loving, that they were still all there together. The other disciples were obviously prepared to tolerate Thomas's implication that they were deluded, and Thomas was prepared to hang on in there even though it may have seemed a bit crazy. Anyway, there they were in the locked room when Jesus appeared once more to all of them, and immediately, without any rebuke, gave Thomas the evidence that he needed. And only then did he tell him to stop doubting and to believe. And then he added this postscript, which suggests that he understood just how difficult belief could be. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And indeed, fast forward about 25 years, and you'll soon discover that some of those earliest Christians who had believed without seeing were getting into a bit of a tangle as to exactly what they did believe. It was Paul who'd first preached about Jesus in the Greek town of Corinth, and now he'd moved on. He was living in Ephesus when he discovered that the beliefs of the little fledgling church that he'd left behind were going a bit astray. So he wrote a letter to straighten them out. And it's that letter, one of the earliest of all Christian writings, from which our second reading came. Now, it has to be said that sometimes Paul's efforts to straighten things out can seem a little convoluted, especially to us 2,000 years on and half a world away, because we don't share some of the same suppositions. It seemed that some of the Corinthian Christians, despite believing in Jesus, didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And the impression I get from the reading is that they did believe that Christ had been raised, that they didn't believe anyone else would be, not even believers. Now, this may not be that surprising, because quite likely these believers, as many of the first Christians were, had originally been Jewish. And the Jews at that time were divided into two main camps: the Pharisees, who did believe in resurrection, and the Sadducees, who didn't. So maybe there was a little pocket of Sadducees there, and as far as they were concerned, when you were dead, you were dead. Paul thought it was quite illogical to believe that Christ was raised from the dead, but his followers wouldn't be. Either there was resurrection, or there wasn't. In his opinion, if there wasn't, the Christian faith was worthless. The whole point of Christ coming back from the dead was to free us from the curse of death. And not just that, but to free us from the curse of sin during our lives. And to free us from the guilt and the punishment and the fear of both of those. What Paul saw in Christ's death and what he understood from his reading of the Old Testament scriptures was a sort of historical symmetry, a logic that to the Jewish mind maybe seemed a bit clearer than it does to us. The Jewish explanation of why our world is so spoilt, why humans can be so inhuman, why greed and cruelty and selfishness is so rife, is that right from the beginning, the first man and the first woman disobeyed God. And from that, sin entered the world. And from that, it was transmitted into every new life. It was endemic. Paradise had been lost. All that came from one man, Adam. And so it was entirely logical that it was one man, Jesus Christ, who came to put it right. Now, we may not today believe that we're all literally descended from one man, Adam, and therefore we might not have that same belief that sin is literally passed down in our genes. But we nevertheless certainly understand the situation that our world has inherited. Greed, cruelty, and selfishness are endemic. Multitudes do feel lost, feel guilty. Multitudes feel condemned to brutally hard lives through their own wrongdoing, or probably more often through the wrongdoing of others, the indifference, the greed, the selfishness. And despite all manner of progress and education, still this sin-ridden world produces death and destruction. It just does it in rather more sophisticated ways. And still, so many people, even those, and perhaps especially those who live in comfort and freedom, still fear that last enemy, death, and live their lives in fear of it. So we may not follow the same logic as Paul, but I suspect that all of us feel that same need. A need for restoration, a need to be redeemed from the bad stuff that dogs us, and to be freed from fear from that last enemy. And that, says Paul, is what Christ has done for us. Wow, that's quite something, isn't it? Not to feel guilty, not to feel burdened, not to feel trapped in addictive behaviour, not to fear that inevitable day when death comes knocking for us. I wonder how many of us here and how many of those around us do fear death, because it's still pretty much a taboo subject, isn't it? And we distance ourselves from it. We dose ourselves with all manner of pills and potions to keep it at bay. I have to say that I sometimes wonder how many people in our society are condemned to live a long, lingering, confused half-life because we and they think that anything is better than facing that last inevitable step into the unknown. But maybe I've just spent rather too long around care homes in these last few years. But what if death weren't the last enemy at all? What if it were just a step over a threshold into something new and amazing? What if it were throwing off this old, limited life and moving into a new one? What if it were a doorway into paradise, a step into a safe home that we've always yearned for, that this world was always meant to be? One reason I like Thomas is that he's prepared to make the statement or ask the question that others might be thinking. If you scroll back the story to the night before Jesus' death, you find Thomas quite prepared to contradict Jesus. Jesus is talking about where he's going to go. Now, Jesus doesn't give much away about the afterlife, does he? But this is what he does say. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Don't worry. My Father's house has many rooms. I'm going to prepare a place for you. I'll come back and take you to be with me there. You know the way there. Oh, no, we don't, says Thomas. We don't know where it is, so how can we know the way? And that prompts Jesus to a reply that at first might seem infuriatingly evasive, but actually tells us all we need to know. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Follow me, says Jesus. That's all you need to know. The trouble for those of us who question stuff is that it doesn't tell us much, does it? It takes us right back to faith. And faith, in the face of all those unknowns, is inevitably going to lead to doubts. It was all very well for Paul. He'd had the most dramatic of conversions. He'd seen a blinding light. He'd heard Christ's voice speaking to him. And there was no question of this being wishful thinking, because he'd been on a completely opposite path at the time, out to kill Christians, certainly not wanting to join them. And in the end, it was all very well for Thomas, because he did see what he needed to see. But for most of us, it isn't like that. We haven't seen. We've perhaps had a tiny glimpse. We have seen something. We've felt something. Something has made a change in us. But we can't be certain. That's okay, says Jesus. I understand that you can't see it all. I understand that it sometimes seems like you feel you can't see where you're going. But you are blessed. I love you even with your doubts. Be blessed. If doubt isn't the opposite of faith, then what is? Some people say that the opposite of faith is certainty. Well, that's an interesting one perhaps to discuss. Others say that the opposite of faith is fear. Actually, I think that there's truth in both those statements. But I don't think that the opposite of faith is doubt. Doubt must be part of our journey. But the point is, it is a journey. Faith is the journey of a lifetime. It's a choice to follow the way, a choice to follow Jesus and his teaching wherever it leads. A journey made in faith, in the expectation that there will be times of uncertainty. A journey made in faith, in expectation of uncertainty. Thomas appears 3 times in the Bible, all in John's Gospel, and each time he says something related to death and resurrection. The first time was when Jesus heard that his friend Lazarus was ill and decided to go to him. Now that was risky because Lazarus lived near Jerusalem and Jesus had only just to flee from Jerusalem. He was actually far away in hiding when he heard the news about Lazarus. Because the Jewish zealots in Jerusalem had been just about to stone him to death. The disciples knew this, and that's why they questioned Jesus' decision to go back into that danger. But Jesus told them that Lazarus had fallen asleep and that he, Jesus, was going to wake them. And later he went on from this rather euphemistic statement to tell them what they couldn't know, that Lazarus was dead. In the end, he told them this plainly, and he added this strange comment: "I'm glad I wasn't there, that you may believe." And then it's Thomas who makes an equally strange comment to the other disciples: "Let us also go, that we may die with him." What did he mean? It's certainly far from clear. Did he mean that even though Lazarus was dead, he believed Jesus could raise him? And if so, then he, Thomas, would like to experience a similar miracle? Or did he mean that he knew that Jesus was walking into the danger of being killed? And if so, he, Thomas, was prepared to go with him and die with him if necessary? As far as I can see, the Bible commentators don't really know, though most tend toward the latter explanation. But either way, the point is, Thomas, loaded as he was with questions and doubts and misunderstandings, was going to follow Jesus, whatever it took and wherever it took him. The thing about faith is that there are 2 activities involved. One involves the head and the other involves the heart. Or perhaps we could more accurately say one involves the right brain and one involves the left. But faith is a journey not just of logic and thinking, but also of feeling and intuition. I think that's what many militant atheists don't grasp, and perhaps why people like me and perhaps doubting Thomas, who are high on the thinking scale rather than the feeling scale, might sometimes struggle. I do think that actually people on the feelings scale might also struggle very much for different reasons. It seems very true and logical to them, but their feelings are telling them something else. So I think the great thing is that Jesus has room for all personality types among his followers. And that's why we especially need to hang in there and cut each other some slack and help each other as we each take our individual different journeys. Because we who've chosen to follow Jesus are on a journey of faith. There will be uncertainties along the way. There will be doubts and sometimes fears. Now, some of our doubts and uncertainties don't matter much, but I do think there's one that does, and however hard it is to explain, the resurrection of Jesus is central. So if you can't grasp it with your head, then hang on to it with your heart, or vice versa. Because the resurrection of Jesus tells us that what we need not fear is our destination. Jesus tells us that we can live without fear. And he doesn't just tell us, but by the power of his risen Spirit, he gives us the help and the means to do so. The resurrection tells us, and it shows us, that it's life that's ahead of us, and that death, the final enemy, has been destroyed. Amen.